Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to this series where we're going through the Bible passages scheduled by the Revised Common Lectionary and giving a radical reading on these Bible passages. So, hopefully you've seen some of the previous videos on this so you can get a feel for what we're doing. That'll help a lot. So, go watch at least the first video in this series. And let's get into this. Today, we're reading Matthew 1:18 through 25. And this is about the angel approaching Joseph, telling him about this child that's about to be divinely conceived. Yeah, we're going to get in the virgin birth in this video. And if anyone's out there thinking, oh, no, I don't know about this. I like when you talk about like living like a good Christian action, how this stuff actually coincides with leftist politics, about actually living your faith. Yeah, I like all that stuff. But when you get into like virgin birth, nope. How can like somebody have a child and not have sex? Look, I'm a rational person, and we'll address that. And if you're thinking that way, then chances are the way we're going to address it later in the video, you haven't heard before. So it'll be fun. Let's look at Matthew 1:18 through 25. It says, "Now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, 'Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins.' All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. 'Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel,' which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus." By the way, Emmanuel means God is with us, and Jesus, or Yeshua, means God saves. That's why it says, name him Jesus, for he will save his people. You know? Now, let's talk about this. First of all, let's talk about the way we even approach the Bible. Very important to talk about. And I've actually been talking about it in the other videos in this series. You've been seeing it on the public YouTube every single Sunday, but I've also been doing this series every single day on my Patreon. So patreon.com/Damon Garcia if you want to go see that special gift for my patrons. And a lot of those videos, as we're looking at these different Bible passages assigned to us by the lectionary, involve me saying, okay, let's realize that Jesus told parables about God, and Jesus' followers told parables about Jesus. And that's what we have as the Gospels, those parables about Jesus. And we must remember the Gospel writers are not historians, they are evangelists. And they're way more concerned with getting people through reading their gospel to follow the way of Jesus, to live that way of life. Way more than getting people to believe correct things about Jesus. Totally not their concern. And so in a lot of these videos, I talk about that, and then with that understanding, we can then stop tripping up on all these contradictory details, stuff that doesn't match up with science, or stuff that doesn't make quite sense, and we could then say, okay, let's approach this as a parable and then talk about what does this mean? For those that don't know what a parable basically is a narrative metaphor, or a metaphor formatted as a narrative or a story. And a parable is really powerful. You should never say, oh, it's just a parable. I mean, some of the most famous parables told by Jesus was the parable of the prodigal son. Son leaves home, finds himself in desperate need, comes back, and his father welcomes him back. The parable of the Good Samaritan. A man gets beaten on the side of the road. Someone passes by. A good guy passes by. A priest passes by, people who you think would help him pass by, and then a Samaritan, the one who Jewish people of the time thought wouldn't help a man in need, stops and helps. It's like these parables were meant to provoke something within you, were meant to directly challenge you. And the way that Jesus told these parables, you have to realize, weren't met with people saying, "Hey, nice parable today, Rabbi. That was a real good one." But in actuality, probably what it looked like was he would tell this parable and it would result in several of his listeners and followers arguing and debating and wrestling with the meaning of this parable. Jesus was Jewish, and this is usually how rabbis and their disciples would approach something. Let's wrestle with this together instead of just listening to what I got to say and say, "Hey, good job, that was great." No. A really good book that breaks down the power of Jesus' parables and the parables told about Jesus by his followers is the book The Power of Parable by John Dominic Crossan. So make sure you check that out if you want to get way deeper on that. But parables were trying to convey a truth so powerful that it couldn't just be told in a lecture or in literal language. It reminds me of what Joseph Campbell said about myths, that myths are so true that they can only be expressed in metaphor. Or like what I've said before, Paul Tillich talking about the power of a symbol. If you understood the power of a symbol, you would never say it's just a symbol. Symbolic language, mythic language, parabolic language isn't less than literal language. It is more than literal language. So true that it can only be expressed in metaphor. So true that it can't be articulated literally. Kind of like when you try to explain why you love the person you're in love with, literal language just doesn't get there. But your best attempt is to say things like, "Well, when I met this person, I felt like I found my other half." Of course, you don't mean that literally. But metaphor is the only thing you can use to try to capture the truth of your love. Or I think the truth expressed through poetic language, like in Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. This was a poetic vision of the world. Sometimes people who get all bent out of shape about how come this part of the Bible doesn't make scientific sense reminds me as if someone were to go to Walt Whitman after he wrote Leaves of Grass and say something like, the world actually isn't the way you described it in this book here, right? You'd understand, oh, that person doesn't get it. The only people who read the Bible literally today are fundamentalists and new atheists. And the old atheists had a better understanding, and all the other Christians are able to realize, no, this is way deeper than literal language. It's a different category of meaning. And the original listeners and readers of these stories would have understood that. It's not that the original listeners of these stories were so unwise that they read them literally, and now today we are wise enough to know that they're not literal. In actuality, they were wise enough to know that these weren't literal, and we over time became unwise enough to think that they should be read literally. And this is largely a result of post-Enlightenment thinking. The Enlightenment shifted the goalposts for what made something true. It became all about it must be scientifically verifiable facts in order to be considered true. And that is the only category of truth. All the other categories of truth that people took for granted were done away with and dismissed. And we ended up with a kind of fact fundamentalism after the Enlightenment. And the church, as they started to get a little bit afraid of modernism and the Enlightenment thinking, and people started to question how they were preaching the stories from this book, they could no longer take this stuff for granted, and they had to have an answer. And probably out of fear of losing control, they decided to just adopt that Enlightenment thinking and say, the way you say those stories are true, sure, these stories are true in the same way. But no, these weren't written as truth in that way. No. This is a different category of meaning, a different category of truth. And it is a more than literal truth, not a less than, or not literal truth either. And if you want to get even deeper on that subject, check out the book by Marcus Borg, Reading the Bible Again for the First Time, Taking the Bible Seriously but Not Literally. I love that subtitle so much because if you actually take the Bible seriously, you can no longer take it literally, once you actually understand the way that this is written and the purpose of it all. All this to say, the birth stories of Jesus that only occur in Matthew and Luke's Gospels and not in Mark's or John's. These birth stories, these Christmas stories, are parabolic overtures that begin their Gospels. I got this phrasing of parabolic overtures from another book. I mentioned a book by John Dominic Crossan and another book by Marcus Borg. Here's a book by John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg, The First Christmas, What the Gospels Really Teach About Jesus' Birth. So everything I'm going to say, most of it is from this book, but if you really want to get deep, like I've been saying, and everything I'm going to say in this video, check this book out, definitely. I'm sure you've heard the word overture in reference to the soundtrack that plays at the beginning of a play or an opera that gives a kind of overview of the songs you're about to hear throughout what you're about to watch. And it kind of works here as well. This is a parabolic overture that gives you an overview of the themes you're about to encounter in this book. And so Matthew and Luke's birth stories, their parabolic overtures, are their entire Christian gospel in miniature before they get into it. And if you get this, then you can get the whole thing. And if you miss this, then you can miss the whole thing. And so, of course, Matthew's birth story and Luke's birth story contradict one another a lot, but that's irrelevant, like I've been saying. And in Matthew's birth story, his specific focus is to talk about Jesus in very similar metaphors and patterns as the way that the birth of Moses was talked about, to set Jesus up as a new Moses. And Luke's birth story, a lot of the patterns are actually similar to Caesar and Caesar's birth stories. And so it's setting Jesus up as a new Caesar, or rather a replacement for Caesar, a better Lord, a better Son of God, a better Savior of the world. All those titles were initially given to Caesar before they were given to Jesus by the first Christians. And stories of a divine conception were very common at the time, even within the Jewish tradition that Jesus came out of and all the initial Christians came out of. But those Jewish stories of divine conception usually consisted of an older and barren woman who usually starts out as pretty bummed out that they can't have kids, and then God comes to them and says, you will have a child, and this child's destiny will be great for your people. And then the woman has sex with her husband, and miraculously she is pregnant. So the Jewish divine conception stories are miraculous because they're postmenopausal births, not virgin births. And this occurred with, off the top, Sarah, Rachel, Hannah, and these were very significant stories within the Jewish tradition. And the Roman pagan religions also had stories of divine conceptions as well. And over the years, sometimes you'll see an atheist documentary feeling like they're exposing the entirety of the Jesus story by saying, yo, other religions had virgin birth stories too. And they feel like it's this big mic drop moment, like, boom, all of Christianity dismissed. Next. And that's a very strange perspective, in my opinion, that if something was said by or about someone before it was said by or about Jesus, then Jesus must be dismissed. Or if something was said by or about anyone before someone else, then they must be dismissed? What? And I know this is in part a response to the post-Enlightenment fundamentalist Christians who have a very competitive spirit and say that Jesus is absolutely unique in order to convince people to only learn about Christianity and nothing else. But the early Christians would highly disagree with those modern fundamentalist Christians as well. Anyone who takes the Bible seriously would disagree with those fundamentalists. But anyway, the Roman and Greek pagan stories of divine conception usually involved a human and a god having sex to have a divine child. And sometimes it was a male human and a female god, but it was usually a female human and a male god. And there was even a story of a divine conception about Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus was the ruling emperor during the birth of Jesus. Let's read that story of his divine conception. This is from Suetonius, who wrote this story down, saying, "When Attia had come in the middle of the night to the solemn service of Apollo, she had her litter set down in the temple and fell asleep, while the rest of the matrons also slept. On a sudden, a serpent glided up to her and shortly went away. When she awoke, she purified herself as if after the embraces of her husband, and at once there appeared on her body a mark in colors like a serpent, and she could never get rid of it, so that presently she ceased ever to go to the public baths. In the 10th month after that, Augustus was born, and was therefore regarded as the son of Apollo." So yes, these stories were common, and they were often used as a way of certifying the authority of a person by giving them a divine conception story. But here's what makes the Christian divine conception story of Jesus unique. Yes, of course, plenty of other divine conception and virgin birth stories told before this, but trust me, this one is unique even though it's not wholly unique. Let me explain. First of all, it's unique from the Jewish tradition that the Christians arose out of. I already explained that in the Jewish divine conception stories, it was a woman who was already married and already having sex, and she was barren, and then she has sex, and then she has a baby. This story is about a woman who has never had sex and isn't even married yet, and she divinely conceives of a child. And this story was unique compared to these Roman and Greek pagan stories because it is about a woman who is still a virgin after the conception. Like as you saw in the story of Augustus that I just read, the woman is not a virgin because she has sex with Apollo or with this serpent. That's why it says, after she woke up, she went to purify herself as if she was with a man. So yeah, there's plenty of stories of women who divinely conceived and were a virgin before the conception, but not after because they had sex with the god. Also, a lot of these stories involve the male god choosing for her to have sex and have this child born through her. This story has this god asking permission, giving this woman a choice, saying, "This is what I want to do through you. Do you want to make this happen?" And she says, "Yes, I will." And there is no physical sex that goes on. She divinely conceives. And a later Catholic dogma says that Mary remained a virgin even after the birth of Jesus. And I think that's just kind of trying too hard to literalize the whole thing. And yeah, it's totally not relevant. We don't need to try so hard to make Mary a literal virgin. That's missing the whole thing. But what I'm wanting to point out here is that the Christian virgin birth story is told the way it is with its very intentional details in order to intentionally exalt this story over all the other divine conception stories. And you may be rolling your eyes right now and thinking, oh yeah, typical Christians, always trying to compete with all the other religions, trying to convince everybody that they're better than everybody else. Yep. But I don't think competitiveness was the spirit behind this choice. I believe they choose to tell this divine conception story of Jesus in a way that exalts it over all the other divine conception stories in order to make the point that this story includes everybody, not just a specific religion or a specific tribe. And that makes sense now why Matthew would make this callback to this verse in Isaiah saying, "Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God is with us. By the way, Matthew retranslates that word that gets translated to virgin there. He makes it say virgin, but the original Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible actually is in reference to a young woman, not a virgin. But he takes that verse and switches it up, changes it to virgin, in order to make this larger point that this is a much bigger story, and it's about all of us, and it's about a God that is with us. Not a God that is stuck in the heavens out there somewhere. Not a God that is only to be found in the palace, like Caesar Augustus, or among the rich people, or among an exclusionary tribe, but actually to be found absolutely everywhere. This is about a God who chooses to come to us instead of forcing us to live in a way that we make our way to this God. And having this story take place in this baby Jesus, this poor Galilean Jew in this family that was also very marginalized in the society, shows that this story belongs to the marginalized, those who experience a lack of support every single day. The purpose of this story is to empower those who feel like no one is with them, that God is with them. And as I've shared before, that's what blessed means, that God is on your side. It doesn't mean that you have a bunch of cool stuff, because the ones that have a bunch of stuff, Jesus says, woe to, not blessed are you. And I want to wrap up this video by reading a portion from this book, The First Christmas, where they say, "It is unwise to imagine that those pre-Enlightenment ancients told incredible stories which we post-Enlightenment moderns have learned to deride. It is wiser to realize that they used powerful metaphors and told profound parables which we have taken literally and misunderstood badly. And that is a warning against either accepting or rejecting metaphor literally and parable factually in texts from a pre-Enlightenment world. Whether taken literally or metaphorically, a divine conception was their way of asserting an individual's transcendental character and extraordinary gifts to the human world. We may, of course, deny that ancient explanation for extraordinary individuality, but we must also admit that we moderns have no better one to take its place. But whether taken literally or metaphorically, historically or parabolically, any claim of a divine conception, whether from virginal, barren, or aged parents, claims that this child has brought or will bring extraordinary or transcendental benefits to the human race. And therefore, the proper question is not about the biology of the mother, but the destiny of the child. What is the destiny, and once you know it, are you willing to commit your life to it? To Caesar the Augustus, for example, or to Jesus the Christ? And so when these gospel writers told this story, that was primarily the question that they were trying to get people to answer. Are you going to believe that Caesar is Lord, who believes he's making a better world through global military violence, or that Jesus is making a better world and this movement through a whole bunch of communities that participate in radical justice and sacrificial love? That's the question we are called to answer when we do read these Christmas stories. And it's interesting, there is this early Roman historian Celsus who really derided the Christians, and when he heard this virgin birth story said, "It is absurd." That's the word he used, that this virgin birth story is absurd. But he didn't say it was absurd because he thought that virgin birth stories were impossible. He thought it was absurd because a virgin birth story was being told about someone in as low a position as this Jesus. Yeah. And yeah, that is absurd. But that's what makes this story so powerful. That we say, nope, we're not going to follow the rich and powerful. We're actually going to be a part of a movement of the marginalized that will ultimately win in history. And that's the story of the Christmas story as well. Mary finds out she's pregnant and says, "Oh yes, praise God, who has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly, sent the rich away empty, and given the hungry good things." We're going to get to that actual passage in one of these Patreon videos. But anyway, thank you for watching this video. Isn't this radical? You get what I'm talking about? Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Subscribe if you haven't already. And follow me on Twitch, twitch.tv/whoisdamon. We stream a lot over there. Talk about this stuff in a more free-form and interactive way. And make sure you go follow me on Patreon, patreon.com/Damon Garcia. Shout out to all my patrons there that support me: Keith Wetzel, Blake the Bold, Stephen Harp, Ranger Jenny, Refined Your Scene, James Finlay, New Transcendentalist, Kristen Mouse, Mike Togman, Peter John Blake, Mimi McGann, Callie, Onion, Keegan James, and Tammy D, and everybody else. I appreciate all the support. And Merry Christmas. May you have a radical Advent. And I can't believe I've spent all this time without just saying Radvent. Next year. See you in the next video, which will be on Christmas. Bye-bye.